Hello, today I'm finally going to share with you the labor and delivery story of my son Leonardo, who's almost 3 months old now. To sum it all up, it was very long, challenging, and very empowering. It was all natural in the hospital with no pain relief, and it took me from start to finish 53 hours, so very long latent labor, but the actual active labor in the hospital was just around 12 hours, so quite average. I used hypnobirthing, especially the breathing exercise, and that definitely got me through the whole thing. My baby was in a brow presentation, which makes everything very complicated, but I'll tell you more about it later. And all in all, it was probably the best day of my life. While I was pregnant, I kind of felt that my baby was going to come early. I felt that he was going to come in the 39th week for some reason, and I got it a little bit wrong because he came at exactly 38 weeks, but not too far off. When we went for the last scan, the doctor also said that he was going to come early. He looked like he was going to come early, maybe even too early. So I was definitely prepared for an early birth mentally, but still I didn't write my birth plan or pack my hospital bag right until the end. In fact, I packed them and wrote my birth plan the day before my labor started. And I think when I did that, I felt mentally prepared, calm, and ready, and my baby must have felt it because the contraction started the next day. So that day, it was Sunday, and I walked around a lot, but I felt kind of uncomfortable, heavy. Baby felt really low, so I decided to skip exercising that day. And I exercised throughout my whole labor right until the day before I went into labor. So I was really very strict about that because I was training for a marathon. I knew that labor was going to be a marathon, and I wanted to be as prepared for it as possible. I'm so glad I did, because in the end my labor did end up being a marathon, and I was prepared for it. After my last walk of the day, 11 p.m., I started feeling contractions, painful contractions. Then I realized that throughout the whole day I was feeling them, but they were not painful. They just felt like kind of tightenings that kind of felt like the baby moving or kicking. And now I know that they were tightenings or Braxton Hicks or something like that, but I never had any Braxton Hicks, so I didn't know what they felt like. So 11 p.m. they started being painful. I thought that I had to go to bed to make sure that I rested. So I went to bed and I started timing them. They were anywhere between 5 and 8 minutes. And I timed them for a couple of hours, but they were not getting closer together, so I just stopped. And it was impossible to sleep through them. They were quite painful, but I could sleep in between them. Sometimes they were even 15 or 20 minutes apart. So I did get a little bit of sleep, maybe an hour or 2 hours in the whole night. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I also had some bloody show. So I definitely knew that something was happening for sure. Bloody show is when your mucus, blood-tinged mucus blood comes out, and it means that that labor is imminent. Now, if regular mucus blood comes out, it might take another week or two, but when it's bloodied, that means that things are already happening for sure. The mucus plug is the mucus that plugs up the cervix, protects the baby from bacteria and anything like that. And when the cervix starts dilating, just before the labor, the mucus basically starts coming out. So that's basically it. I was really desperate to wait until the next morning, not to have to go to the hospital before the next morning, because that's when I had my regular midwife's appointment. I was going to pick up my blood test results, 3rd trimester blood test results, and the strep B test results. And the thing is that I was going to give birth in a private hospital, and they didn't have any kind of access to the data of this public hospital where my blood test results were. So if I was strep B negative and I didn't actually pick up the results myself, they wouldn't know, and so they would want to use antibiotics anyway, just in case. So I wanted to avoid that. I was quite, I really didn't want to be exposed to antibiotics unnecessarily. So I went to pick up the results. Everything was great. My iron was great. Everything was great. I was strep B negative, which was such a relief for me, and I felt completely ready for labor. My midwife as well was sure that I was going to give birth in the next day or two. So I went back home all excited and, kept waiting. And then throughout the day, nothing new happened. My contractions kept happening. They never really went away, but they were always between 3 to 15 minutes. So they were always irregular, but always constant. And they kept being a little bit more uncomfortable as time went by. The second night came and I decided to go to bed and try to sleep, or at least try to lie down to preserve some of the energy, because I knew that things might take quite a while. I tried to lie down, but honestly, the contractions were unbearably painful lying down. I just couldn't bear even one of them. So I ended up getting up and going to the kitchen and just leaning down on my bar table and swaying my hips during the contractions. Eventually, I also brought a pillow so I could bury my face into a pillow, and that really helped as well. I found this rhythm that worked for me, and I just kept doing that the whole night. My husband slept because I told him to, because I realized that it might still take a while, so it's necessary for one of us to be well rested in order to support the other. So I wanted him to be well rested and ready for the event when it happened. The next morning I had much more painful contractions, even though they were not closer together, but they were much more intense. So I was happy knowing that things were happening. Around 1 p.m. I felt much more pain, like the contractions were becoming quite difficult to handle and a little bit closer together, and there was much more bloody show, and there were also tiny blood clots in it, which freaked me out a little bit. Now I know it was just pieces of my mucus plug, but in any case I freaked out a little bit. I started feeling overwhelmed and I really wanted to be in the hospital. I didn't feel safe at home anymore, so I told my husband I thought it was time to go. And as I said that, my hands were shaking and I was, full of adrenaline, and I was getting really stressed out because I realized the time was here. It was going to happen now, and I was going to go to the hospital. I'm so scared of the hospitals. I hate them. The drive to the hospital was 20 minutes, and I had 2 contractions during the drive, but they weren't quite mild. And then another one on the way to the hospital, walking through the parking lot. Then I got to the reception, and I don't think they took me seriously because I was standing, walking, talking, moving like normal. I didn't seem like somebody in pain. So I don't think they really believed that I was in labor. But they got me to a midwife anyway. She checked me and she nearly fell off the chair when she said that I was 3 to 4 centimeters and my waters were bulging. So I was basically in labor. She could not believe that. So they kept me in the hospital. But because my contractions were not regular yet, which they determined after monitoring me for an hour, they couldn't put me in the labor room yet. They had to put me in the maternity ward upstairs. And that is really not nice because there's no privacy, there's way too much light, lots of people, lots of noise. There were 3 beds. I had to share the room with 2 other women, their husbands, the kids. It was not the right environment for the correct hormones of labor at all. And I was getting pretty stressed out because it was around 5 p.m. at that point, and I knew that if by 9 p.m. I hadn't progressed enough, my husband would have had to go home. And I asked the midwife, what exactly do you mean by progressed enough? Because obviously my contractions were not regular, so I couldn't rely on that. So she said, if you reach 6 centimeters, and I was 3-4 at the beginning, if you reach 6 centimeters, then your husband can stay. So I had this goal in my mind to reach 6 centimeters by the time it was 9 p.m. But it was putting a lot of pressure and a lot of stress on me. So it was around 8 o'clock when I started having really long and frequent contractions. I had 3 or 4 of them that were 2 minutes long, 3 minutes apart. So I had only 1 minute of rest in between, and I started to really struggle. They were so strong. And then the next one was even stronger. The next one was even stronger. I started really struggling, and I couldn't get back to the green zone in between them. Then I went to the loo and there was even more blood. So I saw that something was definitely happening, something was changing, and I also realized that I felt quite scared. I started shaking, I started feeling the adrenaline pumping, and I started really wanting some epidural. I felt like I couldn't do it anymore. I wanted to just pack up and go home, which are all signs of the transition stage. So when I realized that, I felt kind of hopeful that I'm close to the end, I'm going through transition, my husband is going to be able to stay, so it's all going to be okay. So we buzzed for the midwife. She said I was 7 centimeters and she could see that my son had lots of black hair. When she said that, I started crying happy tears, and it gave me such a rush of energy because I realized it was almost there and he was real. Even though you have a belly growing and you know that you're pregnant, you kind of don't realize that you're about to meet a baby until something like this happens. When somebody actually physically sees his hair, it just feels surreal, but it makes everything so real for the first time. So they allowed my husband to stay. They moved me to the labor room. They hooked me to the monitors again for another 30 minutes. Luckily, at no point they made me lie down, because they read my birth preferences. They knew I didn't want to lie down. So they managed to do the monitoring while I was standing, swaying around, and I was so grateful for that. They brought me a birthing bowl, but honestly at that point I couldn't use it anymore because it was just too much pressure on my bum. It was 9 p.m. when we started down there, and everybody was sure that we would be done by midnight. And I always read that transition never takes more than an hour or two. So I was like, oh yeah, just an hour or two, and then we'll start pushing, this easy. But my transition actually took much longer than that. It took around 3-4 hours. So I definitely wasn't prepared for that. But the thing is, everybody says that time flies in labor, that you don't even realize how these hours pass, and it's true. It took so long, but it didn't seem like that to me. I was looking at the watch, at the clock, and it was like 10 o'clock. Next time I look at the clock and it's already 10:30. Next time I look at the clock and it's already 11. It was so quick, because I was totally in the zone. Next time the midwife came to check me, a couple of hours later, I was already at 9.5. There was just a tiny lip of cervix left, and she decided to stretch me out and help my cervix to open. And I was so uncomfortable, let me tell you that. It was definitely one of the worst memories from the labor. She had her fingers in while I was having contraction, and at the same time, while she was pulling the cervix out, I had to also push at the same time. And I had to do it maybe 3 or 4 times. Agonizing, really, really difficult. But in the end, we managed to open it up, and she left me for another couple of hours. She said, if you feel the urge to push, then push. And it's not like I felt the urge, but I felt like pushing actually alleviated some of that pain and pressure. So I did that for another couple of hours, walking around and squatting again. And then I felt like nothing was happening, no progress. So I called the midwife back and I said, look, can you check what's happening? I need some help. She got me to lie down, and she was checking, she had her fingers inside, and she was checking whether the baby was actually descending, whether the head was getting closer with each contraction and with each session of pushing. She said the baby was definitely moving lower, so you're doing well, just keep doing what you're doing. And the thing is, in the past, before I went into labor, I was so excited that I might experience something called the baby ejection syndrome reflex. Baby ejection reflex, I think it's called. It's when your body pushes the baby out for you. It's kind of like vomiting. It's an involuntary reflex. You can't even control it. I really wanted to experience that, but unfortunately, because my labor took so long and my uterus was so tired, it just wasn't happening by itself. So I had to physically push him out, but that's okay. Maybe with the next labor I can experience something like that. So she told me that I was doing it all well, but at the same time my contractions started really slowing down, because she kept me lying down checking things for half an hour or so. My contractions started happening every 5 minutes, every 7 minutes, and that was definitely not frequent enough for the pushing stage. She started getting worried, because at that point I had been pushing for nearly 3 hours. She started talking about hooking me up to synthetic oxytocin, the hormone they use for inducing labor, to help make the contraction stronger, to push him out, because she said, if the labor takes too long, the baby can start getting stressed. Although in my case, the heartbeat was always perfect. The baby was never ever in stress. So she was happy to let me try for a bit longer. And as I knew that my labor was stalling anytime I was lying down or sitting down, I knew I had to keep moving. I told her I was going to stand up and start walking around and see if that makes things any better. She also brought me some cookies, because I hadn't eaten for 12 hours, so I was starving. And my husband gave me lots of water, and I just kept pacing up and down the labor room. And as soon as I started doing that, the contractions started happening every couple of minutes, every minute. So I was so happy that hopefully I was going to avoid any kind of intervention and the doctors, and just remain with the midwife in the room. Then that's when I started feeling the baby descending, and his head, tiny bit of his head was showing with each contraction, and then it was kind of being sucked in, showing, and then being sucked in again. That's how the baby stretches you out and minimizes the chances of tearing. So I was happy about that, but it was taking forever, and I didn't feel like I was making any progress. So then the midwife gave me a really good tip. She said not to sway while I'm having contraction and pushing, not to sway my hips around, because you kind of send some of that energy that you could use for pushing, you actually send it into the swaying motion. Instead, if you just squat and remain still and just send all that energy into pushing, is going to be so much more powerful. So basically, not to waste my energy for unnecessary movements. That really made a difference. And also I realized that I was afraid of the pain of crowning. Crowning, the ring of fire, it's really painful. Burns so much. It's probably the worst thing out of the whole labor for me, together with the contractions of pushing. Really, really bad. But then again, it's just because my baby was in the brow presentation. It was not a regular, straightforward labor. So probably that's why it was so bad for me. But I realized that I was holding back. I wasn't pushing with all my might because I didn't want the pain. I realized I had to push into the pain. And when I did that, without swaying my hips and being really still, that's when things started happening. And his head actually came out halfway, twice. Then we called the midwife and we said, the head is coming out, the head is coming out. So she grabbed me and she made me run to the labor room, to the delivery room, which was 2 doors down. So I was running through the corridor, half naked, with my baby's head sticking out of me. It must have been hilarious, but I managed to get to the delivery room just in time. In between the contractions, I had a couple of minutes of rest. His head was out when I arrived, but then by the next contraction, he wiggled back in, and it was such a funny feeling. I could feel his nose and everything. It was so funny. And then with the next contraction, I pushed all of him out, his head and the whole body, out like a cannonball. It was so quick, and I didn't understand what happened. And as soon as it was out, I just collapsed on the bed, and I had no energy to even look back. I was just exhausted. Mission accomplished, that's all. And then my husband shouted, "You're so beautiful and so little." And that's when I looked back and I saw him, and it was just so beautiful, all covered in blood. But it was just so beautiful. And I kissed him on his head, and it smelled so amazing. And I hugged him, and it was just so beautiful. Then they got me to lie down. Once the cord stopped pulsing, my husband got to cut it, and then my placenta came out pretty much instantly within a few minutes. I felt a tiny contraction and it just slid out. I didn't feel anything. It wasn't painful or anything, so that was great. And then they checked me for any kind of tearing. I had one small tear and one small stitch, which is a miracle knowing that it was brow presentation. I'm going to tell you in just a second what brow presentation is. And that's it. Then they left us for 2.5 hours of golden hours, skin to skin, and we got him to breastfeed right away. He knew right away what to do. He was such a little clever man, and it was all good. And then after 2.5 hours, they sent my husband away, but it's kind of good because he had to go home and sleep. We were all completely knackered. And he came back at midday, and we got to enjoy some more time together. And that was really my birth story. Very long, very challenging, but I'm kind of glad that it all came out the way it did. I am so in awe of my body now, of what it can do. The hypnobirthing was incredible for me. I used the up breathing from the Positive Birth Company. Positive Birth Company do a digital pack of hypnobirthing, which I think is around £35. You buy it, and then you get all these videos online with all the information, education about labor, all the tools you need for labor, stress control, relaxation, breathing. It's just incredible. I felt that it prepared me so much. I knew exactly what was happening and how to deal with it. I was completely in control. And the up breathing that I used was basically breathing in for the count of 4, breathing out for the count of 8. I did it from the first painful contraction, from the first painful contraction all the way until the baby was born, and it was all the pain management, pain relief that I needed. I never felt like I needed anything else. They don't have gas in the air in the hospitals here, so that was not an option. Epidural or anything else was never an option for me either, if I could stand it, of course. So I was very pleased to just rely on the breathing and nothing else. So if you're pregnant or about to get pregnant, definitely look into the digital pack from the Positive Birth Company, because I wouldn't have made it without them. I wouldn't have made it without the tools, without the knowledge. It was so incredibly helpful and such a bargain as well. So my baby was in the brow presentation, which basically means that instead of coming out with the back of his head, he came out with a brow, with the top of his head. Now, babies generally come out with this part of the head because they kind of come out like this, because this part is the narrowest one, is around 9 centimeters. If they come with this part, it's 14.5 centimeters, so it's almost 50% wider. And if you look at any kind of midwifery books, they say that it's impossible to birth a brow presentation baby naturally. Generally, they just do a C-section by default. But luckily, I was in a hospital that is very natural, geared to natural birth. So luckily, they didn't push me for that. They didn't even tell me that it was in the brow presentation. And I'm so grateful for that, because if I'd known right from the start, it would have stressed me out. If they tell you that something is impossible, you are much more likely to just believe it and give up too early. So I'm happy they didn't tell me, or perhaps they didn't even know until the very end. I'm not sure what exactly happened, but the fact is that we made something impossible happen, and we didn't get to have a C-section. So that's really, really good. I only found out about it later, a couple of weeks later, and it literally sent shivers down my spine when I realized how close we were to a major surgery, and thank God we didn't have to go there. They say that if the baby's small and the mom's hips are very wide, it might be possible. So I don't know, my hips are quite average. My baby was quite small because it was only 2.86 kilos, 6.3 pounds. It was only 38 weeks. So maybe that's why we made it happen. Or maybe it was all that stretching, all that exercising, all that yoga. I'm not sure. But somehow we made it happen. I definitely expected to have much more tearing with something like this, but only one small tear. It wasn't difficult at all. But because of that long pushing and extreme widening of the bones that had to happen because of brow presentation, I was in so much pain after the birth. In general, I'm just surprised how nobody talks about postpartum, and in my opinion, it's much, much more challenging and much more painful than the actual labor and delivery itself. At least for me, it was like this. I was in so much pain for the next couple of weeks, but perhaps I can talk about that in another video if you're interested. Let me know if you'd like to hear my postpartum story and my breastfeeding story as well. So yeah, that was my whole story. After 24 hours in the hospital, I discharged myself, even though I was supposed to stay for another day, but I discharged myself because I was fine, my baby was fine, so we went home. And that's it. That's how our new life started. I hope I didn't forget anything, because my baby brain is so bad. I keep forgetting everything. I struggle to even speak sometimes. I use wrong words. So if I said some completely random things in this video, I apologize. That's my baby brain. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope that it inspires you. If you're about to give birth yourself, there's nothing to fear. Yes, it's challenging. Yes, it can be painful, but you can go through it if you have the right tools. If you use the up breathing, you can go through anything. At the end of the day, you can go through anything if it's just for a minute and then you get a break. It's not something you can't do. It's not mission impossible. So I'm wishing you a very safe and happy labor and delivery if you're pregnant yourself. If you have given birth in the past yourself, I'd love to hear your story. And also, if you tried hypnobirthing, let me know what you thought of it, whether it helped you. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.